In this video, we will summarize the section T2 using the T2 key takeaway slides. These videos, these summaries, they'll run a little bit longer. That's why I like to separate them from the question and answer parts. That way you can watch those individually and concentrate on that particular set of information for the purposes of the test. This is some enhancement information to help you a little further along. I'll share some experiences with you and try to explain things a little more in depth. This is something that you can use as a help prior to taking the test, but it is also really good information once you start getting your feet wet as a licensed amateur and you start learning the hobby and becoming more familiar with things. Some of this can kind of help you along in that situation. So we'll start with the T2A key takeaways, repeater offsets. That is a pretty basic thing and is pretty much the same on those two particular bands, 2 meters and 70 centimeters, as far as the same for those individual bands being plus or minus 600 on 2 meters kilohertz, and then 70 centimeters plus or minus 5 megahertz. The easiest way to remember that is the bigger the wavelength, the smaller the offset. This is sometimes not always 100% true, and there are special situations. If there's some kind of interference or a coordination issue, repeaters can have odd offsets. They could, for whatever reason, request a different offset frequency, and there's ways to program your radios to accept this. If you get into public safety radios and things like that, the offsets are odd and different. They basically give them two particular frequencies to use, and they program those accordingly. So if you take a public safety radio like a Motorola or something like that, and you repurpose it for amateur use, and you're able to get the programming software or whatever to program that, it will probably just have you, instead of putting an offset in there, it'll have you plug in the two frequencies, the input and output. 146.52 megahertz is the national FM simplex calling frequency for 2 meters. That should be just as common language for you as saying QSY or something like that. That's just something that most all amateurs know and should know, and it appears throughout the exam. So remember that 146.52 megahertz. I do some videos addressing the calling frequencies, and of course we mentioned that one quite frequently. And what those videos pertain to is some of the best practices when it comes to having a conversation or a QSO on those frequencies. And if you get into the parks on the air or summits on the air, whether or not it's a good idea to park on those frequencies and continue calling. Calling procedure. In amateur radio, we usually say the other station's call sign first and then our own. I know if you've ever listened to a lot of public safety in particular, they will they'll say like so-and-so to so-and-so. They'll give their call sign first and then to the other station. And in fact, in my full-time job, that's kind of how we call each other. We have 3-digit numbers for call signs, and we'll say ours first. But in amateur radio, the calling procedure runs the other way, and I've noticed a lot of public safety agencies are kind of adopting this as well. And then CQ means calling any station. It's an open call to anyone listening. A lot of times the summits on the air, parks on the air, they'll get on 146.520 or whatever FM frequency and call CQ. Normally on repeaters, though, it's not a rule or anything, but it's just kind of a best practice is not to use a lot of Q codes and call CQ, just to get on there and say that you're monitoring, and that's actually covered later in the test as well. Duplex and simplex. Simplex is basically you stay on one frequency and you only use one frequency. A lot of times will, in kind of a common term, refer to it as radio to radio. You're not going through a repeater or anything else. You're just talking straight radio to radio, line of sight, or whatever. If you're on UHF, bouncing buildings, that kind of thing. Duplex, you're using a repeater and it's taking at least two frequencies to be able to function and do that. Now, the band plans, they are, as it says in here, they're ARRL guidelines. They're voluntary. They're not FCC regulations. So it's kind of an organization of the bands. So don't be on the CW portion or the data portion of a band, and using voice transmissions. Voice transmissions are much wider, take up a lot more space, and can really cause some interference. Now, CW is welcome anywhere, even on the voice portions of the band, whether it's FM repeaters or whatever. Most FM repeaters will identify in CW or Morse code. A lot of them are programs, if they have the voice identifiers, if it picks up a transmission in the middle of its identifier, it will convert over to CW, because the CW and voice transmissions can kind of exist together without distorting the voice transmission, which is the primary transmission that's going out. But you can actually identify your station in CW anywhere if you'd like to do that. Test transmissions. Every transmission requires at some point that you identify within the 10 minutes that you're supposed to identify. Now, that also means, though, don't just transmit your radio without putting something out of a legitimate signal. It's commonly referred to as kerchunking the repeater, where people will sit and key their radio just to hear the repeater squelch back at them, or some repeaters have Roger beeps or CW identifiers just for keying up, or every 10 minutes the repeater will identify. If you're transmitting, you should be putting out your call sign. And then monitoring etiquette. Say your call sign plus monitoring to indicate you're on a repeater. So instead of getting on a repeater and saying CQ or something like that, or not using the CB breaker or something like that on amateur radio, if you get on a repeater and you do decide to monitor with the intention of making contact with anyone that will converse with you, then just key up and say that you're monitoring. So let's look at this T2B, VHF, UHF practices, CTSS versus DTMF. So the CTCSS tone is a subaudible tone that transmits constantly as you're keying up on your radio, and it gives the repeater, if it's on a repeater and it's set up this way, that it breaks the squelch of that repeater and allows you access. You can also program this on simplex frequencies. So if you and a friend have regular simplex frequencies that you like to converse on, and you don't want to hear stations way off somewhere that maybe they're there but they don't interfere with you, you don't interfere with them, something like that, you can program these tones in and kind of have a in addition to the radio squelch itself, sort of have a double layer of protection for that kind of stuff. Some frequencies on the 2 meter band and even the 70 centimeter band, you can pull up to a gas station that's transmitting Wi-Fi or something like that, and it can make some noise over the frequencies. A lot of our local repeater output frequencies were like that. So the repeater owners set the repeater up to transmit these tones, so that way you could put that in your radio and you didn't have to hear all the squelchy static that comes through when you drive by Wi-Fi or a microwave or something like that hits on the right frequency and causes interference on your radio. DTMF is a dual tone type signaling. Mostly these days it is used by repeater owners that you can type in a combination of numbers and cause or manipulate some kind of function of the repeater. You can turn it off, you can reset it, you can change the power levels. There's lots of different functions that you can do with this. Some older repeaters, you could key up on the input frequency and transmit a DTMF tone, and the repeater would automatically identify. You could trigger the repeater. We had one in the area where I lived many years ago that you could punch the right numbers, and a voice would come across there and say something like, "Oh, you got me," and it'd sound like 2 gunshots or something like that. There was some play functions in there. But the DTMF tones are momentary tones that are transmitted, and then they trigger some kind of function. There are possibilities on radios or repeaters you could set up that you have to transmit that DTMF tone to break the squelch and open the repeater. I don't know of many of those that are being used anymore. I remember in my EMS days, a lot of the hospitals, you had to transmit a DTMF tone because every hospital in the area used the same frequency. So you would transmit a particular DTMF tone to open up that hospital's radio so they could hear you and they didn't have to listen to everybody else. So make sure you know the difference. The DTMF is the same thing as on a touch tone telephone, which I know are few and far between these days. But on your cell phone, if you have the keypad up and it asks you to press 1 or press 2 or something, that tone that you hear when you're pressing that is your DTMF tone. One of the things I did years ago as a young amateur, I had an old house telephone that I had picked up that had the touch tone pad on it, and I was able to figure out that I could take a 12-volt battery, or a 9-volt battery rather, and put it to the red and black wires of that phone and get it powered up without actually connecting it to a phone jack. Take the receiver off, and the portion that you listen to, I could key the mic on my radio, on my 2-meter ham radio, and I could push those buttons and it would emit those tones, and that repeater, the one I was talking about, would pick up on those and actually do the functions of the DTMF. So that was a pretty neat thing as a kid that I experimented with. I also figured out how to power it up and make the ringers ring and all that kind of stuff, but that was sort of a neat function. Now, the reverse function, number 2, a lot of radios will have it on the display or a button on the front of the radio that says REV. If you're on a repeater and you can get to that function, you press that function, HTs will do it. You basically flip your frequencies to where you're monitoring the input of the repeater. I use this a lot just to see if I can hear the stations that are talking on the repeater in a simplex type situation. I'm listening to them radio to radio, and you hit that reverse and just see who all I can hear. A lot of times there'll be multiple people on the repeater and some that need the repeater to talk to the rest of us, so I can't really QSY that person or have them move to a simplex frequency and have a conversation with just them, because I'd be leaving out the other folks. But I always like to see who I can hear whenever I'm on a repeater. QRM and QSY. QRM is interference from other stations. The M, you can say, is man-made, so that's a good way to remember that. QSY means that we're moving, we're shifting, we're going to another frequency. You'll hear somebody say, hey, let's QSY over to 146.55, or you'll hear it a lot on HF. Let's QSY up 3 or something like that, and basically that means you've got an adjacent station that's causing a little bit of QRM because they're too close to you, so you can move about 3 megahertz away from them and maybe not hear them. DMR, digital mobile radio. So this is, I still refer to it as a new thing, but I think it's been over a decade now that it's been around. But they have what's called color codes to access control, and the color codes in digital radio act like a CTCSS tone. The CTCSS tones or the PL tones don't work on digital radio. There's no need to program those in because they won't function on that. But they have color codes that will act in the same way, that you have to program the right color code in order to be able to break the repeater and get into it. And then the talk group IDs is the conversation routing. You program both of these into your radio for its code plug, and that's how DMR works. You got to have the talk group ID and the color code correct, and then you're able to access the repeater, or if it's a node type situation that you have connected to the internet and you're trying to connect to somebody else's node, then you can do that. If you run into, on number 5 here, if you run into some issues getting into a repeater, if you can hear the repeater but you can't talk to the repeater, then there's 3 things to check. Make sure that you have the correct offset. And most radios will automatically put in the correct offset depending on which portion of the 2-meter band that you're on or the 70-centimeter band that you're on. It will determine, and I think most of 70-centimeter is a plus offset or up offset, but 2 meters it could be plus or minus. And most radios will pick up where you're at and know that, hey, this is a set of repeater range frequencies, and we need to be in minus or we need to be in plus here. There may be situations where this is changed away from the norm if they need to have some kind of weird offset, and maybe they just make it negative when it's a positive or something like that. So check and make sure that you have the correct offset. Look up the repeater in the repeater book or something to that effect, and make sure that they should publish what their offset is and all that kind of stuff. Make sure you have the correct CTCSS or PL tone or DCS code. You typically won't have both as far as the input goes, especially. You may have some repeaters out there that you have to have CTCSS to get into the repeater, but it may transmit DCS back out, or vice versa. So make sure you have all that in line. All of those things can prevent access independently to a repeater. And then frequency conflicts, number 6 here, if you run into that. No station owns a frequency. When there's two stations that interfere, they should negotiate. One of the things that you may run into, whether it's repeaters, simplex, nodes, or whatever, is regularly scheduled nets. And this is where listen before you leap or listen before you talk comes in handy, is if you're on a frequency that hosts a regularly scheduled net, especially repeaters. HF, it's a little bit different. Legally speaking, if you're occupying a frequency before the net starts, then it's your frequency. They can ask, but they can't demand that you yield the frequency to them. The courteous thing to do is to yield the frequency to them. It's a little bit different with repeater owners. If the repeater owner, or repeaters, I should say, if the repeater owner has given that net permission to use that repeater at that particular time and those particular dates, then they own that piece of equipment that's being used on that frequency, and it's their prerogative to allow that to happen. So if you're on there and it's unbeknownst to you and somebody comes on and says, hey, we've got a net starting in 5 minutes, the courteous thing to do regardless is to move or maybe step back and check into the net or something like that and accommodate that. But also keep in mind, if you are on a repeater, that repeater owner, if they're allowing that, that's their prerogative. And if there's a conflict that gets out of hand, they can just shut the repeater off. And then audio distortion on FM. So talking too loudly, it causes over deviation and it distorts voice peaks. Speak normally and keep the mic a few inches away from your mouth. Don't overdrive. Not a lot of 2-meter FM and 70-centimeter FM radios, not a lot of them have a adjustable mic gain, but some do. And I know from my days of being in Citizens Band and CB radio, and a lot of you out there may come from CB radio, that there was always that tendency to get that powerful mic, and you turn the mic gain all the way up on the radio and all the way up on the mic itself and just blow it out of the water or whatever. In amateur radio, audio quality is a big thing. You want to sound readable, sound crisp, not overdrive, not take up too much bandwidth or anything like that. So depending on your radio, you may have to, I have some HTs that you've got to really get up on the mic to be heard, and some that the mics are a little bit hot and you have to back off, and there's no way for you to adjust that other than the distance that you have the mic away from your mouth. And then your squelch function, that mutes the receiver when there's no signal, so you don't hear constant static or anything like that. That's one of the beauties of FM. If you come from the Citizens Band world and you've been on AM all these years, you know, you kind of end up having to listen to the static. The squelch will knock out the static even on an AM radio or a sideband radio, but the problem is it also will knock out weak signals, and especially on single sideband, you may be wanting to work a lot of weak signals, so it can mute those out. But on FM, you don't have to put a lot of squelch input to be able to get rid of that, and just have a silent radio when nothing is taking place over the airwaves. So that's one of the beauties of it. I know my dad drove a tractor and trailer when I was a kid and had a CB in there, and I think what a lot of those guys would do is turn the squelch up to where they didn't have to listen to the static noise, but I couldn't imagine just riding around listening to that all day. That's one of the things I've loved about amateur radio in mobile situations, is just having the FM capabilities and not having to listen to all that. And that's where those CTCSS tones also come in handy. If that repeater is transmitting one, that will prevent you from having to listen to interference from electronic items around the radio. So let's look at the final section here, the T2C, public service, what to remember. So the FCC rules always apply. Even in emergencies, there's rules. There's rules that gives you exceptions to rules, but there still rules exist as far as what you can do in an emergency. There is not a specific exception for races, ARIES, FEMA, or anything like that. Other organizations, they can add requirements. They can be more strict, but they can't be less strict. They can't override the FCC. And then races, or I've called it races as well, but just because of ARIES, ARES, that's commonly how that's pronounced. So that's, if you've heard me in earlier videos say it that way, that's probably where I've picked that up. but it's spelled races like car races. They are Part 97 FCC rules activated. They're for government, for civil defense. ARES is a sub-organization of the American Radio Relay League, or the ARRL. Both of them are voluntary, and there's a lot of folks that cross over in both of those organizations. I haven't at this time, but eventually I will do individual videos on those two organizations. So if you're interested in those, then that may be something you want to check out when I get around to those. Emergency privilege exception, that is the only time you're allowed to operate outside your license class privileges. If you have a true life or death or potential of property destruction type emergency, and you need to go into the extra class portion of the band because nobody's on your part of the band or something like that, or you've got an HF radio, you're a technician, and it's 40 meters voice or something, and it's the only way you can get a hold of somebody in an emergency, then there is a very narrow scope, but there is an exception. Net control stations, number 4 here. The net control station calls the net into order. They direct traffic. The net manager handles scheduling. Sometimes this is one and the same person. I did it for a long time. I had a net on C4 FM Fusion that was in a Wires X room, and I pretty much was the chief cook and bottle washer, as they say. I was the net manager. I was the net control station. Eventually, I got a few folks to be able to help me with the net control duties, but the net control doesn't have to verify licenses. And I'll throw in a plug here, too. If you decide to become a net control station or a net coordinator or anything like that, I've got a book that I have written on the very subjects called Net Control, A Practical Guide to Ham Radio Repeater Nets. And it touches on the digital nets and last calls, and then just general net procedures and using programs like NetLogger. And it's available on Amazon. I have not been linking that book in these videos because this is more of a course for your technician class license, but you can look at some of my later videos, and there's a link in the description of those if you're interested in that book, and it's $10 on Amazon. Traffic, number 5, is formal messages. So in a net operation, traffic basically means the messages, the radio traffic, as it's called, that's coming across the air, radiograms. If you do get something like that, and years ago when I was a young ham, I was a net control station for our local net, and one of the things that we always did was we would ask if there's any traffic for the national traffic system, and if we got that, we'd pass it along. Well, I said that generically for years, I guess, for a very long time. I would always ask for that. Nothing was ever heard. I would always go on. Well, then one night out of the blue, and just to give you some context to this was circa 1992, 93, something like that. First Gulf War time, basically. And I get on there and I say, is there any traffic for the national traffic system? And somebody throws out a call sign, and I'm like, what do I do? Holy smoke. I never thought it would really happen. It's one of those things that we just do. And sure enough, I had a message come across the airwaves. A soldier stationed in Iraq, and you got to consider this is pre-internet days and everything, had actually sent a message back home because they didn't have any other way to contact their family. They passed it to an amateur operator over there, wherever they were stationed. I think they were actually either in Iraq or they were in Kuwait. I think they were in Kuwait. Passed that message to an amateur. That message was taken down, and it was passed through the HF bands, and I forget how many hands it went through before it finally got to me, and the person that they were trying to contact lived in my community, and I was actually able to take that and make a phone call and pass on some information. And that was one of the neatest things I ever did, but it's also scary because I was like, I don't know what to do. So make sure that you pass that message exactly as it's received. Don't modify it or summarize it. Give it out as you receive it. It may still happen these days. Even in the internet age, it could potentially happen. And number 6 here, the phonetic alphabet. This is one of my peeves, and you will, if you get on HF, you'll hear it a lot, especially from foreign stations, but even U.S. stations. They'll modify the phonetic alphabet. We should use the NATO ICAO phonetics, the Alpha Bravo Charlie style phonetic alphabet. I actually do a entire video on this very subject, and one of the things that I explain in there is that when I was an emergency medical dispatcher, they taught us to read the cards or the flashcards, or eventually what was on a computer screen, verbatim, exactly the way that it was written. The reason being is that the folks that wrote this stuff, they went through and they researched and figured out what the least ambiguous wording of this is, to where it was highly unlikely that it could be misunderstood. Same thing with the phonetic alphabet. Research that's went into it. It is less likely, it's not impossible, but it is less likely to be misunderstood using these proper phonetics. And it is international. So they've considered all languages and people from all different countries that would need this information and be receiving it. Number 7, the radiogram preamble and check. The preamble contains tracking info. So that message that I received, I'm not sure that I did all this exactly because I didn't know at the time, but I should have had probably a form or something, or it should have been given to me this way as it started, that there should be some tracking info, number, precedence, the origin, and I think a lot of that was in there. There was a lot of that information in there, the date that it originated. And then the check is the word count. Now, I know that part wasn't in there in what I took, but the word count of the text portion. And it's just a quality control mechanism. And then number 8, good operating discipline. In a directed net, only transmit when net control calls on you. Most nets are directed nets. Some nets will announce the fact that they're a directed net. Some of it's just implied. But anytime you check into a net of any kind, whether it's on HF or it's on FM repeater net or something like that, net control should be directing all activities. And when they ask for check-ins, check in. And then when they get back to you, that's when you're opened up to speak, unless you have an emergency, of course. And you're opened up to comment, participate, whatever level of thing that they do on those nets. All right, so I hope you find this information helpful. Again, the goal here is to give you the questions, answers, and brief explanations to help you study for the test. The information contained in this video is just to sort of augment that and give you a little bit more education toward becoming a ham. A lot of this stuff can help you potentially remember the test questions, but I do like to keep it separated in case this is outside of the scope of what you want to deal with right now as far as trying to learn the test. So good luck to you. We do have section T3 coming up after this in the series, so stay tuned for that. And until you get to that section, this is Adam Dye, amateur radio call sign N4NT, saying 7-3.